Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to Hoover, whether in person or virtually, for our first ever Juneteenth celebration. My name is Josie Bianchi, and I work in the director's office here at Hoover. I'm also a member of our Black Associates group, the Black Diaspora United, or what we call BDU. And we found it fitting to start today's event with a brief intro on behalf of BDU as a reflection of how this event came to be. The nascence of it was a bit different and unique than other events here at Hoover, rather than coming out of a working group or a research initiative, or because someone very important was coming to Hoover and the events team had to manage their time here. This one came from us, from myself and Black staff members who looked around and said, hey, we meet monthly, we talk about what it means to be Black at Hoover and at Stanford, and our affinity group is wonderful, but we should really take action and do something for the greater community. With Juneteenth sort of growing in the national consciousness in recent years, with it being made a federal holiday last year, and with all of the new celebrations here at Stanford, we found it fitting to have a version of our own, to do Juneteenth our way, Hoover's way. And so I'm very grateful that this is happening. I couldn't have done it without my colleagues in BDU, especially Anita and Tess. Thank you both so much for all of your organization. To the events team, yeah, give it up, give it up. To the E&P team, as always, Tara on virtual, Hannah and Janet, making sure everyone knows where they're going and that the food is really good that we're going to have afterwards. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And of course, to my director's office team and staff, I feel like the luckiest girl in the world on our team, and thank you guys for being supportive. Of course, to Director Rice, this wouldn't have happened without you, and our panel wouldn't be of the highest quality if you hadn't signed on. So thank you, and with that, I invite you to come up here.
Thanks so much, Josie. And I just have to say that Josie just had a very big weekend because she is class of 2020 and she finally got to graduate from Stanford. Well, I'm delighted to host this Juneteenth celebration. As Josie said, this came from our associates who, when we were talking about what we might do for Black History Month, said, you know, what we think we really want to do is we want to celebrate Juneteenth. It has just been made a federal holiday, and I think it has a particular resonance for the Black community because it's not just the recognition of the achievements of Blacks in America. That's a very important thing to do too. But it's a recognition of what I call very often America's second founding. Since America was in fact founded as a country with, I will say, a birth defect, despite its extraordinary founding documents about equality, it was of course founded as a slave-owning state. And as a result, that founding didn't feel really quite complete. But Juneteenth was a kind of second founding when the slaves then were freed. It's a wonderful and interesting story about slaves who didn't know for a long time that they had been freed, many of them illiterate, many of them, of course, in those days was not easy for information to travel. But in my family, when we first celebrated Juneteenth, I think I was probably in 10 or 11 years old. My parents decided to celebrate this holiday a little bit. It was to imagine how our ancestors must have felt when they found out that they were free. And so it was the second founding for America. It was an extraordinary day for the descendants for the slaves and therefore for descendants of slaves to remember it. But we remember it here at Hoover as an opportunity to bring the communities together. One thing that we've tried to do with our so-called affinity days is to ask our associates who come from those cultures to share their culture with the larger community so that we can all be a part of the joys and the triumphs and the tragedies that define human beings and define different cultures. And so that's what today's celebration is about. Now, I'm going to actually go a little bit off script. Where's Samir? Is she here? Yes. You may have passed through this extraordinary set of display exhibition of some of the things that we have in the Hoover Archives. I have to tell you, I didn't know till we walked in this hallway that we had all these extraordinary things. So I thought it would be a good thing before we get to our panel, if you, the Library and Archives folks, are going to come and tell us a little bit about what's out there, and then we'll get to our panel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samira Bazorgi. I'm head of the exhibitions at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. This is my colleague, Jean Cannon, who's the curator for North American collections. And Kiron had reached out to Eric about pulling some material out of our collection to showcase today. And of course, that's the reason why we do what we do. We love to show people what we have in the Library and Archives, which is open and available to not only Stanford community, but the general public. So today we pulled a selection of material, including posters, photo albums, and other materials that document the Black experience in the United States. We have posters from an artist named Billy Morrow Jackson, who documented in 1965 a series of prints, including one with Uncle Sam and the 4 girls who were killed in the Birmingham church bombings. And Jean can tell you a little bit about a new acquisition that we're really excited to show for the first time, of a photo album that she just recently acquired.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for being here with us. And we're thrilled that so many of you got to see some of the wonderful materials from the Library and Archives. And I can assure you, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We had a great time researching this. One of our newest acquisitions is out here in the case. It's a photograph album, a very rare photograph album, featuring Black women who served in the Women's Auxiliary Corps in World War II. They were stationed in Tennessee, and so you can see photographs of them both in uniform and enjoying themselves when they're not fully in service, and you can really get a sense of community from these photographs. So please, after the program today, stop by and take in these materials, and Samira and I will be out there to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. And I just have to say to the Library and Archive staff and our director of it, Eric Waken, who is unfortunately down with that thing that everybody seems to be getting. I just want to say that we are, after all, a library and archive, and we try to make those materials available to scholars, but also increasingly to our students. We think it's a really wonderful way for our students to engage history. With that, I just want to acknowledge Vice Provost Matt Snip. Matt, I saw you here, yes, who is the Vice Provost for Faculty Development, Diversity, and Engagement here at Stanford. Thank you for joining us on this day. And I'll now call to the stage Kiron Skinner, who is going to be the moderator for our panel.
We also have Professor Caroline Hoxby, who will speak. She's in the economics department and a senior fellow at Hoover. We have Shelby Steele, who you will see, a senior fellow at Hoover on stage or on Zoom. And ultimately, we have Jendayi Frazer, a visiting distinguished fellow at Hoover. And I think she'll speak at the end you'll take care of that.
Before we get to that, we just have a very important guest who's walked in, and I have to introduce her because she's the provost of the university, and that's really important. I was one. This is Persis Drell. Thank you for joining us, Persis.
I think I just, are these on? Learned yesterday that I'm the moderator. I knew I was on a panel, so leave it to Condi Rice to spring something on you at the last minute. But thank you all for being here, and we are being live streamed to the larger Hoover community. So many who are still working at their desk or watching. This is the first time that I've been in the same room with the provost. But her sister and I were both professors in upstate New York. At the same time, I was at Hamilton, and I think she was at Colgate. So we used to conspire about how we were going to get out of upstate New York, and I think we both succeeded. But we had a great year talking, and she is a wonderful historian, and we were facing some of the same challenges early in our career as women in upstate New York. Is a place you may not exactly want to be, but Condi Rice insisted I take that job, and it was a great experience. So I want to start, and Shelby, there he is. Welcome, Shelby Steele. Thank you. I'd like to start by talking about not so much Juneteenth, but what it inspires in terms of your own narrative. I think we as scholars sometimes forget that the larger public and even our own colleagues don't know very much about us, how we got to where we are, and how our own biography has intersected with American history. So I'd like to just be very broad and say, tell us a little bit about yourself. I can prompt it because I do know something important around race and rights for each panelist. But if you'd like to just start, I think I'll start with Caroline.
Okay, so I think I'll start with a photograph. That's an important photograph from my family. Mm-hmm. And it has in it my great-great-grandmother, who was born in slavery. And I'm not that old, okay, but she lived well past her 100th year, so she overlapped with me. And in this photograph, there is my great-great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, who came up from the South, from Georgia, and my grandfather, who got a really good education in Akron, Ohio, and my grandmother, who was fortunate enough to be the daughter of the housekeeper for Kent State University, so she grew up surrounded by books. And then my father, who was the Undersecretary of Education for the United States Department of Education, and also the head of a major foundation. And then there's my older sister, and who is now a vice provost at Princeton. And so I think it's a photograph of all of these different generations and how they came out of slavery and became people who were very well educated. So it's really like a generational photograph of education and the end of slavery and so forth. And I always think of that, like, one person was a slave, one person is the vice provost at Princeton, and it's a wonderful, to me, it's just a story of America and how Black people in America have really been able to improve themselves over time.
Yeah. I think you've gotten us on the right track, because I'd like to tell a similar story. Actually, one of my favorite photographs is of my great-grandmother, Julia. And Julia Head was the daughter of the slave owner. And she was probably 12 or so when slavery ended. But she was known in our family as Grandma Julia, who till the end of her life would sit on her back porch with her pipe in her mouth and her shotgun across her lap, just in case, I guess, somebody was coming. By
the way, she's exactly like my great-great-grandmother, who also did exactly
the same thing. These were tough ladies. They were tough ladies. But great-grandmother Julia, actually, because she was the daughter of slave owners, she learned to read. And that was, of course, illegal for slaves to learn to read, but she learned because she was in the house all of the time. And she then kind of passed on this love of reading to her son, my grandfather, John Wesley Rice. And John Wesley Rice became just somebody who cared a lot about books and intellectual life. And so when he was about 19, he decided he wanted to get book learning in a college. And so he asked how a Black man could go to college, or a Negro could go to college. Probably in his day, a colored man could go to college. And they told him about this little Presbyterian school that was 30 miles from where he lived. It was called Stillman College. And they said they train colored men. So he saved up his cotton. He went off to Stillman College. And he paid for his first year. And then they said, so how are you going to pay for your second year? He said, I'm out of cotton. They said, you're out of luck. But thinking quickly, he asked how those other boys were going to college. And they said, well, they have what's called a scholarship. And if you wanted to have a scholarship, you could be a Presbyterian minister, and then you would have a scholarship. And my grandfather said, that's exactly what I have in mind. And my family's actually been Presbyterian and college educated ever since. But it was John Wesley Rice that took that step that then put our entire family on the road to education. And I think what the theme that you're hearing here is that for so many families who came out of slavery, that next generation, they somehow understood that getting that education was going to matter. I could tell a similar story on my mother's side of, every single one of them being educated. In fact, my grandfather just literally dragging one of his children to college and telling him he didn't have a ticket back, so better stay and get his degree. And so somehow this education was so critical to all of us. And we can talk later about why I fear that that pathway may not be there for all Black Americans today. But in our day, education, it was faith, family, and education.
Absolutely. And I think we all have some stories like that. Before I make remarks, I'd like to hear from Shelby Steele.
No, I agree entirely with what Condi just said in the story. My family is a little bit different. My father had a third grade education. My grandfather was actually a slave. So isn't it ironic that we brag about that? But in any case, he was. My mother, on the other hand, was sort of a little bit upper class white and had a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and yet it was probably my father with his third grade education who was the intellectual in the family. They met as founding members of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, in Chicago in the 40s. And they were civil rights activists for the rest of their lives, constantly involved and in particular in the Chicago area, but nationally as well. And so I was a core baby, as they say. I got a chance to be in that movement and see how it worked, and it is boy, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. I didn't necessarily understand that at the time. I got a little tired of marching around with a sign in the rain, but nevertheless, I got a chance to really, and I suppose this is how even as a kid, made a certain commitment to the struggle that was obviously going to be a part of growing up Black in America. It's what interested me. It's still what interests me more than any other profession. So I see myself as a child of both my parents, and I feel blessed in both counts.
Thank you, Shelby, for those remarks. I'll just say a couple of statements about my own background, and I think we're all telling a version of the same story. But instead of having a Presbyterian background, I have a Lutheran and Catholic from parents that were both born in the South. Quite remarkably, I've had people say, "Why aren't you Baptist?" And I said, no, my mother went from K through 12 to a Catholic school with her 4 siblings, and somehow her parents managed, without much of an education, to pay the tuition, and never missed paying the tuition. But on my father's side, he's from Alabama, and he grew up in a Lutheran household. And the pathway to the middle class was for some of his uncles to become Lutheran ministers. And that's how they were able to get college educated. I believe there's a Black college in Alabama that has buildings named for that wing of my family known as the Dickinsons. Yes. And I tell everyone I grew up battling the Reformation. And ultimately, the mother's religion always wins out. So I settled on Catholic, but I'm completely comfortable in the Protestant Lutheran environment. But education was really key, and many don't know that Condi and I met separately from our families, but ultimately our fathers became friends, both from segregated Alabama. Both went on to get doctorates and be academic administrators and professors in their own right. And at one point, I was working as Condi's postdoc at Stanford when she was provost, and her dad was my dad's boss de facto because he was on the governing board for the California community colleges, where my father was president of a college or two. So education and religion and faith and family, you're right, got us, I think, more than anything else where we are today. But let's go on and have a conversation about Juneteenth and as much as we can about what it means. It is striking that from the Emancipation Proclamation to the time that those in Galveston found out that they were in fact free, there had been several years and a lot had happened, and the Union had won the war, and apparently they didn't even know of that fact. But it means more than Galveston. It's about equality, it's about freedom, democracy, representative government. I'm interested in your thoughts, not about so much of a deep history of Juneteenth, but if you have it, please share it. I'm still learning a lot, and we'll find out that our archive has more than we could ever imagine on that and other episodes. But what of the principles of the American founding do you think are represented in the fact that last year, in a nearly unanimous vote, our Congress approved this national holiday? National holidays speak to our values, but that only works if it's turned into action. So I'll start this time with Condi, move to Carolyn, and then back to Shelby.
Yeah, I just think, as I said a little bit in my opening remarks, I think it's recognition that America's democracy, which I will state unequivocally, I've been all over the world, is the envy of the world in terms of democracy, because whatever problems we have, we actually have dealt better with difference, I think, than any other place that I've ever been. But it's acknowledgement that we didn't start out that way. It's acknowledgement that we started with what I've called the birth defect of slavery. I don't like the word original sin because I actually think there might have been another peoples that probably have a claim to America's original sin. But the notion of a second founding when slavery was abolished, and maybe even a third founding with the civil rights movement of 1964 and 1965, because even though my ancestors probably finally got word and they were now free, we had a long time, almost 100 years, until my father could vote in Alabama reliably, until my parents and I could go to a movie theater. And so the point that I would always make when I was traveling abroad and people would say, well, how can you talk about democracy? How can you talk about American democracy given what your history is it's because of our history that I can talk to you about democracy, not as a final destination point, but as a journey, something that you work toward, that you never quite perfect, that you have to keep putting a brick in day by day. And so it's that activity of building democracy, overcoming and working to deal with your past, that is so important. And I would make one other point. You mentioned Congress almost unanimously agreeing to Juneteenth. America is fortunate to have institutions that were given to us by founding fathers who were definitely imperfect. I mean, Thomas Jefferson with the great words, but still a slave owner, but who gave us these institutions where we have been able to use them to make progress. I think it would have been unthinkable to them that it would have been the Constitution, the courts, that Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP would have used to finally give rights to the descendants of slaves in my home state of Alabama. And one of the things that's sometimes not understood, you know, we know the protest movements. There's a portrait out there. Our artist had a rendering of the 4 little girls who were killed in the Birmingham church in 1963. One of them was my kindergarten classmate, Denise McNair. Another one, Addie Mae Collins, was in my uncle's homeroom. And so this was very personal to me and to my family. And we recognize the violence and we understand the protest and Kelly Ingram Park and Bull Connor's Bulldogs. But it was also the people who, the so-called Margold Report, with the NAACP sitting at a table every Friday morning from 1937 on, deciding what court cases to challenge segregation with, what court cases. They used the institutions. And then finally, of course, you would have the legislation of 64 and 65. So I think it's really important for Americans to recognize that the democratic struggle has many vectors. One is protest, another is activism, but it's also the use of the institutions to the benefit.
Next, Shelby.
I from the very hearing about Juneteenth, it's been a little, hasn't gone down easily. Frankly, it is as it's a story of once again Blacks being victimized and then being saved, in a sense, finally getting the message that slavery was over and that they were free. Some 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, that's not the, what were you doing for 2 years? Didn't someone want to take initiative in some way and say, well, the whole country is free? What's, in other words, it's not a story that shows Blacks in charge. They now have freedom. The great blessing that they have longed for. And it just seems to me that there might be some events in history that would capture that spirit of Black America, the spirit in which we overcame and we insisted on overcoming. We strived to achieve things. And one of my favorite figures is in Black American history is Nat Turner. Now, that makes me kind of radical, but nevertheless, you think about the fate of slaves, and there's a plausibility to what Nat Turner did, and one has to respect someone who says, "Give me liberty or give me death," and that's what he did. I love that. I identify with that. I don't know if I could live up to it, frankly, but I certainly identify with it. So at any rate, it seemed to me Juneteenth pulled us back to this era of Blacks as sort of almost invisible people with no will of their own and so forth. And I think today we face a situation in America that is absolutely remarkable. And that is that racism and racial oppression are over with. They happen, it's over. It's horrible what went on, but we simply are free of that today. In other words, we achieved the freedom we always said we longed for. Martin Luther King longed for, the promised land, and we're there. We've been there now, I think, since the 60s. I would date it at the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 64, Civil Rights Act of 64. We've been free since then. And I think our problem, we keep fighting the problem. Freedom comes always as a shock. It scares the hell out of you. You now are responsible for yourself. And you know you're not in a situation to be competitive with your oppressor, your former oppressor. And so what invariably happens is when we get to that moment where we are clearly free, we deny it. And we say, oh my God, no, racism is everywhere. Racism is systemic. Racism is structural. Racism about on and on. We put that evil demon back in place because we know it. And we have just achieved a victory over it. But what it stops us from doing is understanding that freedom comes with enormous responsibility. And you ignore the responsibility, then you don't develop, you don't grow. Since the mid-60s, when we won our freedom, we slipped into decline. And we have declined relentlessly since the mid-60s. We are farther behind whites today by most socioeconomic measures than we were back in the 1950s, when we were on a slow move, when the government didn't care about us, and we were on a slow movement upwards. So again, it seems to me that Juneteenth does not deal with the problem Blacks have today, which is freedom, not racism. And that we need, I'd love to see a holiday devoted to Black self-help, devoted to being frank with us about responsibility, about overcoming deficits and all of these disparities that we complain about all the time. What if we take responsibility for those things and move us forward? It seems to me that the problem I have with Juneteenth is it's kind of romantic. It doesn't address the real circumstances that Blacks face in this country. And maybe it's interesting to talk about it even in that sense, to be critical of it. Then it probably begins to have some value. We can better see where we actually are with regard to America and the future. But beyond that, it's something that institutions love, things like that, because they can make posters and do TV commercials, and they can sort of, suggest that they're all for minorities, and so they paper the wall with pro-minority posters and so forth. Well, we're still falling farther behind. In the state of California, the Black 12th graders graduate at an 8th grade level. I'm sure everybody here today has got a pile of statistics saying pretty much the same thing. Illegitimacy rates, broken families. We have some real problems. And no, protesting racism is now not suddenly, but has become irrelevant. And it just seems to me that if we're going to tiptoe into the area of race, we got to be a little braver and really go a little deeper and see if there isn't some way to get to move us ahead beyond, if there isn't some way to move us ahead. Let me just leave it there. Thank you.
I thought I would just read a nice quotation from John Albuquerque, who said, "Let's make Juneteenth a commemorative event, not of an horrific institution that our country embraced, but rather as a showcase of the strength of the American spirit to recognize wrong and set about making it right. In this spirit, America moves ahead today in leveling playing fields and achieving greater equality. Let us all celebrate Juneteenth, which teaches us about our country's greatness in our use of our hearts to hear and learn and to work together for all that is good and just.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Thank you for those comments. And Shelby, there's a lot to unpack in what he offered. And I think much of what you said really has to be turned into a set of hypotheses about where we are now on issues of race and rights in America. I do think freedom is the battleground of the future. It always has been, and how that interacts with race is worth thinking about a lot more systematically. And I do think your larger point is about African Americans taking agency, and you're asking what happened in Galveston around that issue. I don't really have the answer, but I think it's worth understanding what was going on in those couple of years. And I think we may see some defining ideas essays coming out of Hoover using the archives on that fact. And I know that you are right about the statistics of where we are as a nation with African American education statistics and unemployment and opportunity. But I also think there is a different Black America that is emerging that will probably be part of the self-correction of what's happened since the civil rights era. I believe 1 in 50 African Americans now is classified as a millionaire in the US. During the period of Donald Trump's presidency, more African Americans enrolled in medical school coming out of college than at any point in recent years. I'm a graduate of Spelman College, a small African American college for women in Atlanta. And according to the NSF, 50% of all Black women who get a PhD in a STEM field get their first degree from Spelman College. And I remember the dean, Dr. Etta Faulkner, who in the 80s had a vision of a natural sciences division that has become what it is actually today. So I do think there's more agency going on in African American communities than is largely reported on. And Shelby, you've talked about the profound impact of African Americans in the cultural realm, in music, and in art, and how that's had a global impact. So I think there's a great narrative that we can tell that takes away from the grim statistics that are also true.
If I could just add to that, I really do think we need to spend more time on this question of agency. And I want to thank Shelby for a more challenging way to think about race in America, because it's very easy to lay blame on history or circumstances or whatever, and not to think about how you get out of it. And Kiron, your point about Spelman reminds me, so a friend grew up around the corner from me, and his name is Freeman Robovsky. He's been the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County for I think 18 years or something. They have produced more Black male PhDs in the STEM fields than all the other places combined. And it's because they set out to say this is a missing link, Black people who really are in the STEM fields. So there are people who are, I think, trying to do something about this. What we have to remember is, as we are, I hope, increasing the numbers of Black Americans in education, in the intelligentsia, so to speak, in universities and the like, that there are a lot of people who got left behind. And so one of my concerns is, if I look at the K-12 education system, and this would speak to Shelby's point, there are just too many Black kids who in 3rd grade can't read. And if you can't read by the time you're 3rd grade, you're not going to read. And one of the things that we do a lot of work here at Hoover is on K-12 education reform, the role of school choice, the role of vouchers, because the really interesting thing about agency is, if you want to see poor parents lined up around the block, just put the opportunity out there for an opportunity scholarship or a voucher or a charter school, and you will see those parents lined up around the block because they want their kids to have a better start than they did. And so I think this can be a challenging conversation, not just a commemorative one, as you said.
And I can't agree more. I think that Black parents actually are more aware of the fact that their kids need to get a good education and that they're often being put into schools that are just not promising.
This is your area.
This is my area.
That was teeing you up,
Sorry.
by the way, yeah.
Sorry, I work on this. And no, I think I can remember being in a charter school in Chicago and was all Black, basically. Okay. Charter school in Chicago, and having Black parents just coming in the door and saying, can't I please find some way to get my child into this school? Because I want my child to have a good education. And it was really, there was a certain level of desperation because there were only so many places in the charter school and they didn't want their kids to go to the regular public school. And yeah, I mean, I think they really care.
They really care.
They really care.
I see that Josie is giving me the sign if anyone has a question. Is that what you're doing, Josie? So if there are questions, we have a couple people with mics. So any questions from the audience?
This is a panel of professors. We can begin to point people out and ask you.
Yeah, we do cold call. I see someone right over here and then Russell down here. Yeah.
This has been a fascinating discussion, and I learned a lot from Shelby about Nat Turner. So guess what? I looked on my iPhone. He was executed on November 11th, which happens to be a rather 11/11, as you may know, is World War I armistice. I guess I'd like to ask Shelby or anyone else on the panel, would it be constructive or counterproductive to have some kind of commemoration of his death by hanging on November 11th, by the way, in Jerusalem, Virginia?
So for everyone, I'll have Shelby respond to that. That was Paul Wolfowitz, a visiting fellow at Hoover, speaking, who's been a longtime friend and also a fellow traveler in the issues that we're talking about today. Shelby, over to you.
Well, I would love to see a commemoration of Nat Turner. I would love to see him floating in American culture like Patrick Henry is floating in American culture. Give me liberty or give me death. This is what happens when a people decide they are absolutely going to be free. We see even at this moment, so in the Ukraine, this attitude, well, God bless them. None of us know what will ultimately be the result of it, but isn't it a marvelous thing to see people take their fate, which is terrible, being bombed and so forth, and say nothing is going to stop or prevent us from achieving liberty and freedom. That's what makes America great. We have that singularity of devotion to an atavism. And Nat Turner, if somebody said to anybody here, you get up in the morning and before light, you work hard all day, you eat pathetic, stringy food, and so forth. And then you do that the next day and the next day, and then you die. Give me death. And when people have that attitude, it means that is an embrace of responsibility. Oh, I am now free. I am therefore now responsible. I have choices to make. I have directions to pursue. I'm happy to have my fate in my own hands. I don't think Blacks will ever be equal as a group, certainly, until we have that uncompromising determination to. For example, when I see institutions lower standards to let blacks in, and this, you are weakening people who are really ready to embrace difficulty, who are willing to stretch themselves. And you come in because it makes your institution look like you're sensitive to racism. You come in and steal that away from them. The woman who just was appointed to the Supreme Court, because the president wanted a Black woman. What is that? So we have a Black on the court, but the court betrayed its own highest values in bringing her on the court, because this kind of liberal reformism believes that Blacks are really inferior and that they cannot cut it. And they need the intervention of benign governments and organizations to get across the street, apparently. But I notice in those areas of life where there's no interference and no sympathy. Basketball, how about? Sports of music, so many other areas like that, where Blacks thrive and compete with everybody else.
I think Shelby's suggesting that we need affirmative action in the NBA. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, yes. So there's certain groups that can't cut it now, but therefore, out of the spirit of inclusiveness, we'll lower the standards.
Yeah, we'll make sure. Yeah. Let me just. I'm going to go to Russell in 1 second here. I do want to say. The woman who actually did get appointed to the Supreme Court was awfully well qualified. I think the question
is by
raising
it. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, but by raising it in that way, that you wanted to appoint somebody who was Black, did you actually maybe undermine the argument about her qualifications? And I think that's a point worth making.
Condi, if I could just do a two-finger intervention there. I actually think
a two-finger intervention is what academics say when they want to. Yeah, go ahead.
I learned it from you. So I think it doesn't matter whether you talked about race in the context of the woman being appointed to the Supreme Court, because there's such toxicity and division in our political system. She was going to be seen as suspect in any case. So it bothers me little that the president wanted to appoint a Black woman. She was clearly more qualified than most who would otherwise have been nominated. I just think we're still in a very racialized conversation. And that's where I think Shelby makes an important point. Freedom is really hard, and one of the ways to hold it back is through to continually keep race in the dialogue. And it was going to be there with her in any case.
Yeah, good point. Russell.
Yeah, can I just say?
Sure. No, another two-finger intervention. Sorry. Yes.
Sorry. I have been really bothered by the fact that almost every time she's discussed, they say the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, instead of saying she's this extremely well-qualified person who went to Harvard Law School and was on the law review and so forth and so on.
Yeah,
I agree.
That's not her only qualification as being a Black woman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Russell.
Thanks for this panel. Thanks for the celebration. In several of your narratives, you talked about the role of church affiliation, faith, religion in your family's history and in the freedom movement in general. How do you see the standing of religion and faith in the predicament that we face today as Americans in general?
Yeah.
That's a hard one, so I'll give it over to Condi.
Russell, I would start by saying I don't think we talk about it enough. Look, I'm a very religious person, and I'd be the first to say that I'm more than happy to talk about my faith. But it's almost become a no-go zone for conversation. So I will sometimes have students come to me and they will almost whisper, I understand you're religious, and I am too, right? So, and sometimes, and Provost Drell knows that I bring this up pretty frequently. When we talk about marginalized or groups who feel that they're not really included in, I'll just use our the Stanford dialogue, we don't sometimes realize how marginalized religious kids feel. Whether they are Jewish or Protestant or Catholic or whatever, because in our public spaces, we've confused the idea that the government should have no religious preferences with the idea that if we have religious discussions, we're somehow violating church and state. And I think it's a particularly bad set of circumstances now because people are really obviously looking for something that feeds a part of them that just the mind doesn't feed. And I'll call it the soul, maybe others would call it the spirit. We see unbelievable levels of suicides among young people, and I mean among high school kids. And you think, how could that be? Because we've all blamed social media, but something else is going on. And I think we just forget that human beings are spiritual beings as well as intellectual beings. And so I hope that we can open up some space in our discussions and in our dialogues for the role of religion. I think in the Black community, it's still pretty strong. And you're still asked by your aunts and your cousins, did you go to church today? That's still a question. But I do think we're not opening enough space in public spaces for that discussion.
Shelby, did you want to respond to the question by your colleague Russell Verman about religion and the role it has played?
I don't think we would be here as a group were it not for the Black church. This is the most rock steady institution in Black America, and it always has been. When everything else failed us, the church was there, and it's there today. It just I'm surprised that. Because it is an old it is such an old institution and so much a part of the Black community. So the problem with it again is sometimes it survives by sort of tempering its by avoiding some difficult questions of politics and culture and so forth, and can sometimes, because people go to it for different reasons. So I see that limitation, and I wish it wasn't there. But overall, I think the Black church is an extremely, everybody can go there. Everybody can find coherence through religion in the Black church today, and can do the right thing. It supports family life, the development of children, and so forth. The values. It's simply mandatory. There's no way not to. And it never dies. That's something else. No matter how unpopular, uncool it is, un-Black power it is, it doesn't die. It stands in there.
Thank you, Shelby. I think we have,
I think
are we done with questions?
Yes.
For the most part? We have a presentation. Condi, you want to
yes.
tee that up, please?
Yes, if you can tee up the presentation from Jendayi.
Good afternoon, friends and colleagues at Hoover. Happy Juneteenth. I wish I could be there with you today, but I'm across the world in Kigali, Rwanda. But I'm honored to be part of Hoover's first celebration of Juneteenth. I think it's so appropriate because Hoover stands for the freedom of people, societies, and markets worldwide, and Juneteenth is Freedom Day. I remember when I first celebrated Juneteenth, I was actually at Stanford as an undergraduate, a freshman at Stanford, and I remember how much fun it was, the sense of community, the family going to picnics, really being embraced at Stanford. My family was far away, many miles away in Frankfurt, Germany at the time. And so Juneteenth has become a very special holiday for me over many, many years. But when I think about Juneteenth, I also think about our continued responsibility to support those people who are struggling for their freedom, who are struggling for greater democracy. I think about the struggle of African Americans in the United States for greater freedom and for their civil rights over all these years and for their emancipation, and how that inspired Africans in their struggle for liberty against colonialism. And even today, I reflect on the Ukrainians and how they're fighting the tyranny of Russia. And so I think while we celebrate and enjoy the day, we also have to recommit ourselves to supporting that freedom of people everywhere in the world, their struggles for voice, their struggles for liberty, their struggles, frankly, for human rights and to be counted. And so I hope that you really enjoy the picnic, the fun, the food, the music, the sense of community and family that's being created at Hoover today. With that, again, happy Juneteenth, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
That was, of course, our distinguished visiting fellow, Jendayi Frazer. Jendayi was ambassador to South Africa, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and as you can see, is currently in Africa, but we look forward to welcoming her back here to Hoover. And with that, turn it back to Kiron, who will end our.
Those were wonderful closing remarks. And as I just sit here listening and looking at the audience, some of you I've known for 30 years. I came to Hoover as a research assistant, a research fellow for George Shultz when he was writing his memoir. And at that point in Hoover's history, there were so few women fellows that I just recall becoming really great friends with the staff. There were quite a few staff members who were women, and some of those are still my friends today. They're probably my best friends. I never lost a friend. But what was interesting is that Hoover was very good at being colorblind. And I think what we see today, there was just no sense of discrimination. And when I interviewed with George Shultz, I don't think race ever came up. And once he saw that I could write, I had the job. But what Hoover's now doing under Secretary Rice and Provost Drell, I think is becoming color brave. And having this discussion, I think today is the beginning of having some hard conversations that will continue into the future. And it's no surprise that the staff at Hoover pushed us to live up to our larger selves. So thank you all for joining, and we will do this again. And now let's have a party.